Hello, everyone. Today we get double the value of one podcast. We have two amazing guests, and you have to just listen the regular amount, which is about 30 minutes. We have with us Edward Brodkin, who is an associate professor of psychiatry at the Pallathra School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Edward has many talents. He knows how to play the clarinet. I guess he probably was able to get many girlfriends in his youth with that skill. He practiced team sports. He also practiced Shen style Tai Chi. So a very diverse of things going on in that brain of yours, Edward. And we have Ashley Pallathra, who is a clinical research and therapist. She has a master's degree in psychology and currently pursuing her PhD in clinical psychology. Her research focuses on autism, social neuroscience, and social emotional functioning in the youth. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. This is such an amazing opportunity to just discover, unravel some of those layers of the brains and how we can interact with other people in a more effective manner. How about if we start with you, Edward? Can you tell us a little bit about your background, maybe from the time that you were in high school until now that you are a psychiatrist?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Alan. I'll try to make a long story short. So in high school, as you mentioned, I was really into music, played the clarinet, played in a lot of groups and so on, and then went to college, was interested in becoming a doctor, and went to medical school. And then as I was in medical school, I got really interested in brain and behavior and how the brain works and things like that. So I knew I wanted to go into some specialty related to that. And then I just found psychiatry the most interesting and did a psychiatry residency. And then during my residency, I had the good fortune to work with a professor there who was interested in adults on the autism spectrum. His name is Chris McDougall, Dr. McDougall. And that was my first real introduction to the autism spectrum and the study of the way people relate to each other and how that varies among neurodiverse people. So I got really, really interested in that. And then after my residency, did some research fellowships on neuroscience and genetics. And, you know, the rest is history, as they say. I've gotten really involved in this field of the study of autism and the way the brain works. And when it comes to this book that we're going to be talking about today, really not just the autism spectrum, but for any of us, how do we better relate to each other and connect with each other?
If I could ask you, when you were a young man, what is it that attracted you to study the brain?
Well, you know, when you're in medical school and you start to think about specialties, it's like the first day before you even go to medical school, when you're admitted, your relatives start saying to you, what kind of a doctor are you going to be? And then, and if you say like an orthopedist or something, they say, could I show you this elbow I have that's sore? So, you know, from day one of medical school, you start to think about it like, well, what kind of a doctor would I be? And then I started to think, and I would say this to my friends in medical school, that when you choose a specialty, you're kind of choosing to spend the rest of your life thinking about one organ system usually. And I mean, to me, the most interesting organ was the brain, how the brain works and consciousness and emotions and thoughts and things like that. So I guess that's kind of how I got into it.
Well, that makes sense. Well, how about you, Ashley? What is it that? How do you stumble upon psychology?
I truly did stumble upon it. I think back in high school, early college, I was always interested in human behavior and just understanding how people think and act. And it was a very random volunteer position that was next door to where my parents worked, and they recommended that I go and work there just as a part-time job. And that's where I started to meet a lot of people on the spectrum and started to understand what autism spectrum disorder was. And it just fell in love with the idea of neurodiversity and how to understand people along a spectrum. And then I just sort of got more so into psychology and neuroscience research, which is how Ted and I met. when I was conducting research in his lab, and then soon started working with him after college. I think as someone who came from an Indian American family, I didn't know a lot about psychology and a lot about what it meant to be a psychologist. So it was a real learning process to figure out what a career would actually look like in this mental health space. So it took some time. I did some neuroscience lab research with Ted, and then I slowly realized that I could not work with mice all my life, that I needed to go more into a clinical space. And so after working for a while, I applied to a PhD program. So I'm now training to be a clinical psychologist and doing therapy mostly with children, adolescents. I think since working together with Ted, we just really connected on this interest in understanding social connection and how it's really just this foundational component that carries across so many different psychological disorders. It's a very, I think, transdiagnostic construct that's so important to healing. And so when we were working on this project with adults with autism, it just made us realize that it's so translatable to all populations, this idea of connection and loneliness and, this urge that people seem to have to really, to find those genuine connections with other people. So I'm grateful that I can continue to focus on that through my work now.
Let me ask you, as an Indian American person, do you find that there is a stigma against searching out for help, psychological help, psychiatrist help, or has that been normalized?
No, I think we're working towards it, but I think there's still a huge stigma across racial, ethnic, minority communities in terms of accessing mental health services. But I think also just having education around what does mental health issues look like. Because I think sometimes that definition can be different across different groups, and it can be harder for people to know, like, this is a point where I deserve to ask for help. And so that's why I really love working with, in particular, I think, Brown and Black communities who are just starting to kind of dip their toe into what it would be like to get mental health support. And so it's always so fun for me to help people transition to that, because I was someone who also didn't know that much about it, and so had to learn along the way. So it's fun to walk with people on that journey.
Yeah, my psychologist help through all my infancy has been, be a man, suck it up, don't cry. That's always been my psychological help, and I spanking here and there just to make sure I got the message.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about we are here because you guys just published a book called Missing Each Other: How to Cultivate Meaningful Connections. Can you tell me how the idea came about? You guys worked together at a given moment, and then what, someone had the brilliant idea to say, hey, let's write a book together? Is that how it went?
I'm gonna give that credit to Ted. That was his definite brilliant idea, and look at us now.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
how first of all, what is the book about? How did it work that you guys got together, and you don't even live in the same city? So I think that add an extra layer of complexity, and then we go more in detail about the content of the book.
Do you want me to say, Ashley?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So actually, originally, when we started thinking about this book, we were both in Philadelphia because Ashley was working with me on a project in my research lab. But the project itself had to do with how to help adults on the spectrum to be more comfortable in social situations, to feel more skillful in terms of connecting with others. And then Ashley and I had many, many discussions during several years of working together. And we started to say, I think maybe what we're really trying to teach here is something called attunement, which we can talk more about. And I thought to myself, maybe there's a book in this. I said it to Ashley one day. I think she thought it was maybe a bit of a pipe dream, but here we are. And I also, the more we thought about it together, I thought, this isn't just relevant to people on the spectrum. This is really relevant to all of us. So the book is really directed towards everyone and anyone.
Well, and I'm so grateful because most scientists or experts in the field, they just write mostly to each other. They do research paper that only other scientists get to read, and people like me who is not on that field just miss out on that information. So thank you so much for putting it together. Okay, so then can we go into more on more in depth in the book? You talk about the 4 pillars of human connection, and also you give us some exercises on how we can develop better communication skill. Maybe Ashley, can you just tell us more or less what's in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we could just start with more so defining what is attunement. I think in general, we think of it as this elevated social skill. It's this ability to be able to connect with your own state of mind and body while also connecting with another person. And I think attunement, more so, we're thinking of this sort of almost ephemeral connection that you feel when you really understand someone and you're really connecting. You're sort of in sync with each other, in tune, and you're able to kind of stay in sync with them through the twists and turns of any interaction. Because we think about attunement as not just something that you develop with someone that you truly love or that you have a very intimate relationship with. We think of attunement as something, as a skill that you can build with anybody, with an acquaintance, with a stranger, with someone that you're arguing with colleagues. It's about how to maintain that connection. And I think why it's resonating with so many people is because attunement can be tricky for a number of different reasons. Like, you might have trouble accessing your own emotions or state of mind, and then that might be getting in the way of your connection. Or you might be having trouble reading other people, understanding what they're trying to communicate. And so the point of us breaking it down, I think, is to give people a chance to try and understand where is it harder for them to make those connections. And then more specifically, here are some exercises that we're hoping will really target those specific pillars like you're talking about. So we break it down into 4 components, and we can walk through each one. But in general, we say that they're made up of relaxed awareness, of listening skills, understanding skills, and then mutual responsiveness. And we break it down into 4 components, but we really do think of them as working together. Like, you're constantly moving through each one in a dynamic fashion. But I think for the purposes of a book, it's just easier to think about them individually at first. Yeah.
So how do we access our own emotion? I mean, I sometimes I feel like we don't even know exactly how we feel or what we think about things. I feel like we are bombarded with information 24 hours a day. We have all this social pressure telling us how to behave and what to do and what not to say. And it's just, I tell you how I access my emotions just by writing. And when I write, I say to myself, wow, that's really what I was thinking about, because I'm surprised by my own writing. But I mean, I feel like I'm in a position of privilege. I have the time to reflect. I'm a blogger, so I have the time and kind of the pressure to access those thoughts out of my mind. But most people, they don't have that luxury. They're running to their jobs, and then they come home, and then they go into Netflix, and Netflix tells them what to think about and what to feel. And in between all that, all the millions of advertisement messages. So yeah, then the questions again is, how do we access our own emotion?
I think that you described that so well, Alan. I have to say, I can just see it and feel it when you're describing that. And that's exactly right. We're bombarded. We're bombarded with information and things coming at us and things to do and responsibilities and our job and our family. It's hard. And I think when we get bombarded, we can sort of just get pulled out of ourselves and just get caught up in, all these things. So that's why what we call the foundation of attunement is relaxed awareness, which is similar to mindfulness. Some of your listeners are probably familiar with that. The way we describe it is combining an awareness of what's going on inside yourself and around you, but also trying to relax while being aware. And that's actually really hard to do because, like you're saying, a lot of the things coming at us are stressful. And maybe even some of the things we're feeling don't feel so good and we don't really want to feel them. So to try to be aware of those things and to kind of stay cool and calm and relaxed, even while feeling somewhat emotional, is really hard. It's challenging. It sounds simple, but it's really challenging. So what we do, I mean, a simple kind of answer to your question is sometimes to know what we're feeling, it can really help to tune into ourselves physically, believe it or not. Like, so notice simple things like my shoulders feel really tense. I've got a stomach ache, or, you know, or I feel really good. Or so starting with the body, so to speak, starting with yourself physically. And the exercises that we describe for relaxed awareness start with some physical things like stretching exercises, trying to loosen up, like let go of that tension in your shoulders. Simple sort of mindfulness exercises. So being aware of your posture, being aware of your breath, letting yourself relax in that, and then practicing that on your own, hopefully on a regular basis, even just a few minutes a day, so that it becomes a kind of a muscle memory, so that when you are in the midst of all that hectic, crazy stuff of your day, you almost have this habit of, you can just take that breath and let your shoulders drop, and you can even momentarily just get back in touch with yourself and kind of tune into yourself. And ironically, by tuning into yourself, sometimes that helps you tune into other people.
Mm.
And I wanted to add, you mentioned how, like, in terms of privilege, a lot of people will feel like, I don't have 20 minutes a day to meditate, or I don't have the space to really take time to be thinking about and practice introspection. And so that's why we tried to adapt the exercises in different ways, where you can be doing it by yourself when you're sitting and having a quiet moment. We've also adapted it in ways where you can practice it while you're walking from work or walking from your job to your car. Even just 30 seconds or a minute, I think, is a great place to start. That's where I started in my meditation journey. Just, I put a timer on and I couldn't even get through 30 seconds. It was so challenging for me. And so it might be, but at least giving yourself, knowing that there's value in even under a minute of access to learning to access how you're feeling physically and emotionally is gold, I think.
Okay, great. So then let's move on to the other pillar of connection, which is listening. How do we become better listeners, and maybe one or two exercise? Because as you have noticed, we just finished an election right now in the States, and people just don't listen to each other. They just talk on top of each other, and they each one have to want to have the last word. None of them really want to hear the message from the other side. And you know, this is an exaggeration, but it happens every day in all kind of aspects of our life. We just talk over each other, and we just are not interested in listening. So how can we become better listeners?
I can start. So, I mean, I think in general, you know, we're not trying to purport some fancy definition of listening. We really do mean just trying to understand what someone is communicating. But I think not just listening to the words that they're saying, but also listening to their nonverbal cues. Where is their eye contact going? Are they fidgeting as they're talking? You know, what's the tone of their voice, the pauses in their speech? All of that is going to give you valuable information to understand what they're trying to communicate. But I think one of the key points of listening that I think is really important when trying to facilitate effective dialogue is, believe it or not, listening to both them and yourself. And so that's why we talk about relaxed awareness first. It's that foundation where when you are having really difficult conversations like the ones that you just described, lots of things are happening within you. You might be getting fired up or activated or sad based on what you're hearing. And so we talk about our exercises in a way where you practice balancing your attention between hearing what they're saying and also checking back into what's happening for you. And so one of the exercises we talk about is, if you take a couple minutes with a partner or someone, even, you know, over the phone or by Zoom, if you're not with someone in person, having a chance to just let them talk for a couple minutes, have them talk about their day, have them talk about their favorite show, whatever it might be. And you can just practice not worrying about saying anything back, but just practice listening. And what is that skill like to hear what they're saying and determine what they're communicating, and then checking back in with yourself. How are you feeling? How is it affecting? How are you responding or reacting to that? And then at the end of the conversation, check in with them. Like, ask them, my understanding of what you just said was this. And that will give them an opportunity to let you know, is that accurate or not?
As simple as it sounds, I find listening to be one of the hardest skill in communication. I think it's the most challenging, more challenging than even expressing your ideas correctly. It's just trying to digest what the other person is saying. So yeah, okay. So let's move on. How about understanding? How do we understand each other better?
I think building on what Ashley said, I think each of these things builds on each other. So the relaxed awareness is the foundation, then the listening. And then if we're able to really listen, which I agree is challenging, Alan, um, as we're listening to the other person, being open enough to consider, like, how are they viewing the world here? What's their perspective? What's my perspective? How do those two perspectives differ, maybe? But I can tolerate that. Like, if you, Alan, have a somewhat different perspective on what we're talking about, or our life, or on life in general, than me, that I could tolerate that and still listen to you, and still have a connection with you. And also, one thing that Ashley wrote so well about in the book is sort of understanding our own filters, like what gets in the way of us understanding the other person. That I tend to see people such and such a way, or I tend to react, I've got this, if you push this button, I'm going to react emotionally in a certain way. And those things can get in the way of us really understanding each other. I think the other thing is that for both listening and understanding, you kind of have to buy into the idea that this can be really powerful, because I think, kind of like what you're saying, Alan, in our culture, we emphasize talking and asserting ourselves and getting our point of view across and things like that, and arguing. And things like listening to the other person and understanding may seem kind of passive and like, well, I'm not getting my point of view across. But what you have to realize is those things are actually surprisingly powerful. Like, if I really listen to you, and you can tell that I'm really listening to you and I'm really trying to understand, it opens up something between us where there's a bit of a connection forms. And then within that connection, I actually have more power, so to speak, not really power over you, but power to communicate, power to, maybe you'll listen to me more if I listen to you, that sort of thing. So, and if I think if listeners think back to a time when someone really, really listened to them and how powerful that can feel, that might help them sort of buy into that.
And do you think having a more diverse group of friends, let's say, or more diverse workplace, increase that understanding of each other? Because let's say you are working in an environment where with other, let's say, 20 white dudes, let's say. I don't know if your understanding will be as broad as someone who works with people with all races and sexes and ages and cultural or religions differences.
Well, as a white dude, I'll try to answer that. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think working, living, being friends with, getting to know a diverse group of people is really crucial, because you come to understand that we're all humans. I mean, there are cultural differences and things like that, but if you're only with your same sort of gender and ethnic group and so on, you're more vulnerable to starting to stereotype others or not really understand others and their humanity.
Wow. Okay, so let's close with the last pillar of connection, mutual responsiveness. Ashley?
Sure. So mutual responsiveness, we kind of think of as like the glue that puts it all together, where you're trying to really stay with one another in that connection as a conversation moves up and down. And so one of the elements that we talk about for mutual responsiveness is meeting someone where they are. Really meeting them where they are in terms of what mood they're in, what they're describing. I think we talk about, we give a lot of examples in terms of how we think that makes communication more effective, especially if you're, I mean, not just in a positive interaction, but if you're arguing or if you're debating or if you're trying to get your point across, oftentimes, like Ted was saying, you have more power in that situation to hear one another if you meet each other where you are. And ultimately, if you stay flexible, like say you are going to have a conversation with someone who has a different point of view than you do. If you get prepared and you practice all these talking points and all these specific points of view, as the other person is talking, if you're not able to kind of stay in the flow with them, and sort of are just always thinking about what you want to communicate and what you want to say, then you're going to lose each other and you're ultimately probably going to find a disconnect. Whereas if you're able to be a little bit more flexible, have that preparation, but you know, are able to move with them as they go in different directions, that's when we think, you know, it's oftentimes you feel that fluidity in the connection more often, which is great.
Okay, my last question. So with all these communication tools that we got the phone, we got the laptop, we have, I don't know, so many pings and pangs coming at us. Are we getting better or worse at connecting with each other?
That is a hard question to answer. I feel like there's so many different ways to go with
I
that.
guess it depends on the person. Or,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say like an easy answer in terms of yes or no. I think maybe one part that I always talk about is this idea that we're having less opportunity to practice those skills that once were so easy to access because you were talking to people all the time in person, you were seeing your neighbors, you were going to work in person. Now we're just in a situation where we're more and more isolated and communicating through devices instead of with each other. So we always, I mean, in parts of the book as well, talk about the value and not underestimating how important that in-person practice can be.
wow, this is all amazing information. Can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow each one of you in social media or your website or whatever it is that you disseminate information?
Well, the title of the book is Missing Each Other, How to Cultivate Meaningful Connections. And we have a book website, so it's missingeachother.com. And that website has lots of links and lots of information. And we're also each on Twitter. So I'm at Ted Brodkin and Ashley is at Ashley Pallathra on Twitter.
Thank you so much for being here. This has been an amazing, enlightening conversation and it helped us connect with each other.
Thank you so much, Ilan. It was great to connect with you.
Yes, thank you so much.